Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe, and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'm glad to welcome you to today's webinar. Today we'll be talking about mobility and borders in Europe. Europe is a place of free movement among nations. Or is it? The Schengen area, which was established in 1985, enables the movement of people, goods, and capital across national borders. And in many senses, Schengen has been a huge benefit and has had an impact on the lives of millions of European citizens. But there are some restrictions to this free movement, and that's part of what we'll talk about today. I'm delighted to welcome two experts, Professor Dr. Kiran Klaus Patel and Young Leader alum Dr. Isaac Stanley-Becker. Kiran is the chair of modern history at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, where he also directs the Project House Europe, which is a research center at the university that promotes an interdisciplinary approach to studying the history of Europe. Kiran, herzlich willkommen.
Many thanks for the invitation, and hello, good morning and good afternoon.
We're delighted to have you, and we're also absolutely delighted to have Isaac with us today. He's a national security reporter at the Washington Post, and perhaps more relevant for our conversation, his book, Europe Without Borders, just hit the stands at the bookstores and Amazon and anywhere where you can get books. And that book was really kind of the catalyst for having today's conversation. So, Isaac, thanks so much for bringing your book to our attention and being available to talk about it.
Thank you, Steve.
So let me just maybe set the stage briefly, because I'm not sure how familiar all of our viewers are about the Schengen Agreement, and the two of you should certainly feel free to sort of add to this, but I just wanted to put it into a little bit of context that in 1985, it was France, Germany, and the Benelux countries that agreed to do away with border controls because there was sort of a shared understanding, a shared vision that the internal market, or having an internal market where goods, money, capital, and people could flow freely, would really help strengthen Europe. And for decades, really, the Schengen Agreement was in place and contributed to the free movement of people, goods, and labor. But today we're finding that some elements of the Schengen Agreement seem to be under under threat as countries really try to find a balance between free movement, but also dealing with cross-border policing, dealing with immigration, and of course, in an election year here in Germany, dealing with political consent. And I think it's important to reflect a little bit on what things looked like in 1985 and what sort of the impetus was for creating Schengen, but then also what some of the differences are that exist today and how we've gotten to that point. So, Isaac, let's start with you and maybe not dive into the book, but you also recently had a piece in the New York Times, and in it you wrote that what exists today wasn't meant to be, that the European integration promised the abolition of borders and an increasingly closer union that allowed this free movement of people, goods, and capital in a single market, and that there are some hurdles to this right now. So maybe you could start by taking us back to 1985 and what the atmosphere in Europe was like at that time and what prompted Schengen being brought about.
Thank you. I mean, this is really the question that in many ways animates the book of where did this system that is really now taken for granted in many ways, where did it come from? There is a recognition of free movement and prized by some, criticized by others, but it has become kind of interwoven into the fabric of the European Union and life in the European Union. And what I set out to understand was, where did this system come from? What was the genesis, and what were some of the early controversies over its terms? And I think I would, there are a number of important strains, and I think I would kind of isolate just a couple. There was a important economic and commercial rationale, and an important kind of civic and humanist rationale. And Schengen married them in interesting, but also somewhat conflicted and complex ways. And I guess I would point to two kind of events or moments, one actually before 1985 and one after 1985 that speak to this. In 1984, there is a European Council summit at Fontainebleau in France, where François Mitterrand, the president of France, proclaims this vision of citizens' Europe. So a vision of European integration that would go just beyond just economic integration and speak to kind of civic solidarity, sports teams, culture, music, a European anthem, a flag, so on and so forth. And this becomes an important jumping off point and rationale for Schengen, that you provide to the citizens of Europe something more than just common integrated markets, but some sense of civic solidarity and togetherness and community. And then in 1987, which is after Schengen, the initial Schengen Accord is signed, we have the Single European Act, which is an important moment in the completion of the single market and the kind of economic vision of integrated markets, the removal of customs controls and other barriers to the free flow of commerce, capital, goods, and so on. And importantly, sets a 1992 deadline for the completion of the internal market. Schengen also anticipates this as an important kind of driver and laboratory for the effort to complete a vision of economic integration. And it marries these two visions. It says that we want economic integration, but it also needs to have some basis or some legitimacy based on a more humanist vision and a vision of Europe that provides something to people qua people and not just workers or economic actors. So these are two really important strains and rationales for Schengen. And then just finally, briefly, there's the kind of everyday convenience aspect of this, which is tied into both. In 1984, there are a series of strikes by truckers and long-distance lorry drivers in Europe, and it becomes hugely bothersome to cross frontiers in Europe. And there's a recognition by European leaders that this system is untenable and that it would speed not only commerce and economic interests, but also travelers, vacationers, people, trying to get to the Alps for vacation. And, that's an important rationale too, just making life easier for everyday people. And that's really how we get the initial Schengen Accord in 1985.
So let's sort of put a pin in that for a moment, and we will come back to that in just a second. But I'd like to bring Kiran into the conversation and talk a little bit more broadly about sort of the institutional context, if you will, for some of what Isaac was sharing with us. You wrote a book called Project Europe, and in that you talk a little bit about European integration and some of the institutions that have contributed to that growing integration during the post-World War II period in Europe. And if we go, even further back in history than Isaac went, we have to begin with sort of the European coal and steel community, which later became the European community and, obviously ultimately became the European Union, which has really been the tool, the mechanism for Europe's international organization, but also for being able to create the kinds of fora for something like Schengen to come into place. And I guess it would be really valuable to hear you sort of weigh in on how you've seen Europe grow together, which helped contribute to the desire to create the Schengen area in the first place.
Right, thank you. Again, growing together, I think, is a very good metaphor in this context because it has to do, as Isaac said, with functional logics, with ideational goals and dreams at the time, but also with these institutions. And if you look at the institutions, Schengen is a very interesting story because, as you, Steve, said at the beginning, it was only 5 states that started cooperating, that signed the agreement in June 1985, which then ultimately led to Schengen, the Schengen area. So what does this mean? At the time, in 1985, we had 10 member states of the then European community. So it's only half. And I think it's already a reminder that this whole idea of doing away with the borders was quite controversial from the outset. There were these ideas that Isaac highlighted, but there was also resistance for all kinds of reasons. People fearing terrorism, also kind of drug trafficking, all kinds of criminality coming cross-border, xenophobic arguments being part of the mix, obviously, which explains why, if you have this idea that there is the European Union as the one towering structure, we have to be careful to see that this was not always the case. The European Union today is the top dog in Europe's international governance, the top organization. But it was interesting at the time that amongst the member states, there was no consensus to fold this new idea into the existing organizations. But what they did is to start a sideshow, basically, an agreement outside the treaties that existed, which again only kind of included 5 of the 10 member states. So it was a little bit of a sideshow to try out if something of this kind could work, which also left space for those member states of the then European community, the British, the Irish, the Danish, the Greek, for instance, that were more reluctant to join the club on the outside. And I think that is quite typical for how European integration has evolved. The euro would be another example with the currency, where not to this day all member states of the European Union are part of that club also. So we need to kind of be aware of this rather complicated, patchy landscape of institutions where Schengen for a long time was then seen as a success because it turned from a sideshow into one of the main threads of European integration. Already in 1997, it was integrated into the European community with the Amsterdam Treaty. But again, only after this period of tryout, if you will, of around a dozen years. So in that sense, let's be careful that we see that today's European Union was not the starting point of this whole exercise. The main player were the same, again, Mitterrand and Kohl, whom I would also like to mention, because I think very much of what this came to be was also his idea, and German governments pushing for this agreement. But it was still not only a different time, but also different institutional reality in which this was forming.
I mean, I think that that different institutional reality is incredibly important, but I'd be really interested in hearing both of you talk about sort of how interest in being part of Schengen grew over time, right? I mean, as we've talked about, 5 countries that have borders directly with each other decided to embark on this to begin with. And I think one can look and say, gee, it's pretty successful when you think about the number of countries that eventually became part of Schengen. A lot happened historically between 1985 and even 1997, let alone today. And I mean, I'm thinking specifically about the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of Eastern Europe, I mean, German unification, but a number of the countries that today are part of Schengen used to be behind the Iron Curtain. So can you both talk a little bit about how this growth took place from 5 member states, if you will, being part of the Schengen area to what we have today?
Well, the history really bears this out. I mean, even thinking about the building blocks and formation of Schengen, it began on a smaller scale. So the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands already have a system of free movement. And in 1984, France and West Germany, under the Saarbrücken Agreement, begin dismantling bilateral, controls at the border between those 2 countries under a bilateral agreement. And then very quickly, there's an interest in merging these 2 because the Benelux countries are interested in kind of glomming on to what France and West Germany were doing. So, this is the reason for the initial 5. And as Kiran, rightly points out, negotiated entirely at the intergovernmental level outside of the EU institutions, and very intentionally so, because there was an understanding both that this was an important laboratory and test bed for some of these ideas that were best, not hampered by some of the need for consensus more broadly, but also because there was an awareness that there wasn't a grant in existing European Union law or European Community law under the Treaty of Rome for this kind of broader guarantee of free movement that wouldn't just apply to workers or economic actors. And then very quickly, there's interest in accession by other states. Italy, almost right away in 1986, 1987 is interested in joining, but there's some resistance from the initial Schengen member states because of Italy's vulnerability to irregular migration and illegal entry, in Southern Europe. So right away, we see how some of the dilemmas, there's an interest in extending and expanding Schengen and realizing its benefits across a broader swath of Europe, but also a real attention to some of the security risks and migration risks that come with this. But as you say, it does in fact grow. Italy, Spain, Portugal are early member states. Of course, with the Eastern enlargement in 2004, that's followed relatively quickly within a couple of years by the entry of Poland, the Czech Republic, and some of those other countries extending Schengen's frontier eastward. And the impact and the meaning of that can't be overstated because, as you say, these were initially countries that were perceived as migratory risks to Schengen, included on lists of undesirable countries whose nationals were threatening to the project of Schengen because it always tried to pair internal freedom of movement with external security. So Schengen kind of tracks the whole transformation of Europe in with the hinge of 1989 and all that means for the continent.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to add to that, there is an interesting paradox at play, I would argue. Again, one of the main ideas and drivers of the whole plan of Schengen is federalism, right? That you want to create something that supersedes the nation states, that there is an open flow, as Steve, you rightly said, of people, but also goods and so on across borders. But ironically, you could argue it also hinges on and depends on at least the trust that the other member states are living up and have the capabilities to also control then any kind of unwanted cross-border flows, be it people, be it commodities, whatever. So in that sense, also one of the reasons why Italy, for instance, joins only in 97, slightly later than the others, is because, again, also the others felt that Italy isn't ready yet, and that it has to do with Italian state structures, that the country isn't ready yet to join the club. So it was also seen as something rather exclusivist, and it's no surprise that it was the countries more to the northwest that felt that they have these state structures well in place to allow for also this new level of liberty between them. So I think there is an inbuilt tension, which is also playing out today, of course, where the system is under much pressure and much threat, and where the whole question of whether we can trust ourselves enough to keep these borders open internally is, again, so much at the level or kind of the core of the discussion.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get into sort of the current situation in just a moment, but I'd like to maybe first ask you to share what the criteria were for a country to join the Schengen area and whether those criteria have evolved over the last 40 years or changed in any way, because I think that's an important factor as well.
They've grown. There's the Schengen Border Code, which stipulates a lot of this, and they've expanded and been enhanced, but it has spoken to the same kind of requirements, throughout this period, and it really is largely about the capacity to secure Schengen's external perimeter, both in terms of kind of physical capacity, but then also technological sophistication and digital tools, because an important part of Schengen is the creation of the Schengen information system and data sharing among the countries to track unwanted people, goods, otherwise. And this required a degree of technical sophistication. There are also important stipulations about law enforcement cooperation and ability to integrate policing infrastructure with the other European states. And as we've seen, some countries have been able to adapt to this and prove their capacity more quickly than others. And for some, it's taken many years to demonstrate the both kind of technical sophistication and some of the resources required. There are also, of course, large, sums of money that are provided by the European Union now to make this possible. It's a major expense and allotment of funds, but it's been no small task.
Maybe just to add to that,
Yeah,
one
please.
important moment maybe is 2004, when Frontex was founded, this agency that many people will have heard of, which has become quite infamous also in its policies with regard to pushback of illegal, undocumented migrants, particularly in the Mediterranean. So in that sense, it's just another reminder that a lot of the capacities to also execute what is in these stipulations is still kind of provided by the member states. There is a rather thin but increasingly thicker layer of, again, EU funding, but also EU, if you will, kind of capacities with regard to institutional players and so on, that is put on top of these intergovernmental dimensions. And at the same time, the whole question hinges on trust, right? Do we trust that others are able to make sure that we only get those things across our internal borders that we want to flow across them? And that is, I think, the interesting moment that also puts aside quite some distance between us in 2025 and the mid-1980s into the early and mid-1990s, because it took a full 10 years to really start the full process and have the first borders being opened on the basis of the 85 agreement, when there was a lot of elite, at least elite agreement to try this out, to push for this. I would also say that if you look at the media, there was more reluctance to really go that far. So many people were rather unsure in the media, and also if you look at opinion polls, whether this was the right way forward. And it was also some political leaders who were pushing for this. So in that sense, the somewhat elitist dimension that has always been part and parcel of European integration is also something you find there, even if, of course, many people immediately and very quickly like the system, particularly those who had jobs across borders, as I did, for instance. I crossed the border for many years on a daily basis, and it was so cool to leave Germany, be on a motorway, go into the Netherlands without having to worry about anything, basically. And that is what many Europeans have felt over the years, without probably worrying then too much about the more problematic sites that not everybody was able to migrate as freely as some of us do who might have European passports, but also the more problematic sides when it comes to, again, letting people in or things move across borders that are more problematic.
Mm-hmm. Let me come back to, or let us come back to some of those problems in just a moment. I want to pick up on what you were both just saying, though, about the movement within the area, but also ensuring that there is a secure external perimeter. And earlier, we were talking a little bit about the issue of federalism, and how that sort of ties into all of this. One of our viewers is curious to know a little bit more about what responsibilities sort of remained under the control of national responsibility, or sorry, the national authority of a member state, as opposed to what was sort of ordered above that through the European Union, in terms of laws, in terms of regulations, in terms of responsibilities. Isaac,
Virtually,
you're nodding your head, so I'll let you start first.
it's an important question because even though Schengen in some ways sets up this transnational system of free movement, the responsibilities and authorities still very much fall to the individual member states. And this is important in preserving a sense of national sovereignty and national autonomy, issues that are become extremely controversial in the ratification process in the early 90s, when the implementing convention goes before the member states, and there's lots of concerns across kind of center-right and more right-wing parties about issues of sovereignty and national autonomy. And explicitly, the treaty vests these responsibilities with national authorities. It does not create new supranational institutions. And this, again, also becomes somewhat controversial for other reasons, because you have new authorities which rely in some ways on kind of transnational security systems, the Schengen Information System, which allows data sharing among countries, but there is no kind of supranational body to exercise oversight, exercise authority over this. So there's the kind of it's incommensurate, and there's civil liberties concerns that are raised about this. And there's so Schengen is always criticized from the right as being too internationalist, as requiring the ceding of national control, but it's also criticized in some ways from the left as not providing a kind of international check on some of these national powers, which are drawing on powerful security tools that reach across borders.
Kiran, do you have anything to add to that?
Maybe just to add again that this again for me is exactly that paradox, right, between federalist hopes that some had at the time, including somebody like Kohl to some extent, and again also reluctance also in all these governments, right? So if you were looking, for instance, what the ministries of kind of the interior wanted and what some of the chancellors, presidents, and so on wanted, there was always tension, right? And again, those in charge of policing always said this is going to be a nightmare, and many of them didn't believe that this was possible. So in that sense, it's also interesting, but it has created exactly as in many other fields of European integration, a solution that is somewhere in between, right? That is neither just in a very, if you will, traditional sense, intergovernmental, where every member state's government just does basically what they want and sovereignty remains large and you only cooperate where you fully feel comfortable in bringing in, chipping in, basically, nor has it become fully federalist. And it is interesting that it was never the case that borders were fully open amongst the member states. So France, for instance, reintroduced border controls early on again. So in that sense, the situation that we're facing now over the past 2 or 3 years, or also that was very symbolic also during the pandemic when borders were closed, that was not the first time that this happened post-Schengen, basically. So it's a constant renegotiation of what it means in practice for people. And what we do see is certainly that the pendulum is still swinging further away from the idea of further opening, even if, of course, the beginning of this year was a moment where 2 new countries joined the Schengen club, which is still considered to be a prestigious club by many, right, with Romania and Bulgaria. So in that sense, being part of the club is something many want, even if the Brits, for instance, from the beginning said we're not going to be part of this. So it didn't take Brexit for them to leave because they never really joined. So in that sense, it's always been contested, as any project of European integration actually has been. And it is interesting that it was still so successful that it was folded into the European Union. And I would argue that that wasn't fully clear at the beginning, whether it would really go so far, that so many member states would want this, as we would then already see by 97. So that was the hope some were harboring in the early to mid 1980s, again, when discussions started. And it is a success if you just look at the institutional dimension, that this did become so important over the years, and it is now part of the European Union.
Since you brought up Bulgaria and Romania, let's stick with them for just a moment. Why was it only on January 1st of 2025 that they were admitted into the Schengen area?
Well, I think it in some ways speaks to important just regional geographies here and where they sit in terms of, again, these migratory and security risks, that it was a longer process of, proving competence on some of these external border questions. And I think, this in just the last days and weeks, I think has been an important illustration of this paradox that Kiran is highlighting, which runs through the history of Schengen. So you have Romania and Bulgaria join this privileged club, celebrated entrance, and right away there's a reintroduction of controls in certain places between Romania and Bulgaria. So, what is the practical effect here, given the inclination to reintroduce these controls, which has become more and more common? I think you rightly point out that this has been the case, and in the treaty, there's a explicit allowance to reintroduce controls for reasons of national security and public policy. But it has become more and more common and in a much more systematic way. So instead of, for the World Cup for a period of 6 weeks, we'll have controls, but all land borders indefinitely or a period of 6 months. This is sort of goes beyond, I think, what had been anticipated by the treaty makers.
That's right. So, I mean, the agreement itself certainly allows for temporary closures and for spot checks along the border. I think that this has been in the headlines again because the German government recently made a decision to reintroduce border controls with its neighbors in Poland, the Czech Republic, Austria, and Switzerland. And for many people, this is sort of a signal of maybe moving away from Schengen. But it kind of begs the question of how the Schengen area handles security and border controls in general, particularly when it's dealing with big challenges like terrorism or irregular migration. And I would even add to that, and Kieran, you already brought it up in a sense, are there any lessons to be learned from the COVID time? When certainly a number of countries kind of closed their borders to try to keep the pandemic out.
If I may, I just first add a small footnote to what Isaac said. I fully agree to what he was kind of describing there. I think one interesting factor that we have to see in European integration is also that once you're in normally, unless you want to leave yourself. And what we've seen is also that there was quite a bit of reluctance to have Romania and Bulgaria being accepted as member states of the European Union, where many felt that these countries were not fully fit to live up to the requirements of membership.
Mhm.
And if you will, keeping countries out of some of the subclubs like the Euro, like also Schengen, for instance, is one of the torture instruments, if you will, that Brussels still has to then make sure people, or governments, I should rather say, live up to the commitments across the board. So in that sense, also there, I think there is this dimension of being treated second class once again these torture instruments are still available for vis-a-vis these countries, and that is also one of the reasons why there has been reluctance to accept them early on as member states. Now, when it comes to the pandemic and your question, I think what we saw was that again with very generous, I should say, interpretations of the stipulations of Schengen, it was possible to go quite far. And there was little resistance against this because the question is, which force, which power should have been there really to say, no, we don't accept these borders to be closed. So, think of a different scenario. Who would be the National Guard that would just gear up and tell national police persons, no, you don't do this, the borders remain open? This is something the European Union doesn't have because it relies on national police forces and agencies and bureaucracies in general. So in that sense, since there was amongst several member states, big member states, important member states, a certain agreement to close borders, there was little basically that those who felt they didn't like it could do against this. This again shows the fragility or the specific construction, I should rather say, of the system, as Isaac already explained. The other thing I think that became quite clear that the common market, again, the whole dimension of fostering wealth through again these open borders. And Isaac was before already referring to the strikes of lorry drivers in the early 1980s, mid 1980s, as also one of the starting points of the whole process. Was also something where certain actors, including Angela Merkel, I think were then really thinking hard whether the price wasn't too high to keep the borders closed for too permanently. It is interesting that for commercial products, it was always, there were less restrictions basically during the pandemic than there were for people going to work, for instance. And closing the borders, and of course, hence also jeopardizing production chains across the member states, was a real threat, a real question during the pandemic. And where I think the lesson was that if the restrictions should become too harsh, the danger of fundamental economic crisis was too big, which also explains why there was then, again, this policy was very complicated going back and forth to reopen borders again, to keep them more open also for commercial goods than for people. And also just to add that to the equation, and the kind of in 2020 already by the German government, and that was executed a year later, have also this new next generation EU funds being then installed. Again, maybe just go a little bit beyond Schengen here for one moment, because I think it is linked in an interesting way. For a long time, particularly the German government was reluctant to accept any shared debts, basically, and any more kind of programs that had redistributive dimensions of a social policy kind at the EU level. Now, this budget, 750 billion euros, that was agreed upon at the time, was something that most people in the summer of 2000 would have considered inconceivable. And it was then agreed on quite quickly. Several countries have been pushing with this for quite some time, particularly the more southern countries of the European Union, whereas particularly Merkel had always been reluctant. But I think that was the moment where she felt if there isn't more support for the common market, the cost is going to be immense also for the German economy. And that was absolutely linked to, again, keeping also borders or reopening borders, keeping them comparably open, because otherwise the cost would have been too high. So the economic rationale, more than the idealistic dimension that Isaac was mentioning as two main strands that was pushing for this in the early days, I think was one of the main reasons why the level of openness that we still have, let's put it that way, persists basically, because without that commercial rationale, probably borders would have been, closed again to a larger extent that we now see.
And I guess, picking up on that point, Isaac, one of the aspects that you cover in your book is while there's the rosy side of the free movement of people within the European Union, this isn't necessarily something that everybody who's within the EU is able to truly take advantage of, and that there are certain members of the population, certain members of society who are sort of more limited in terms of their freedoms. Can you talk a little bit about that piece of this as well?
It's an important part of it. And I think I want to stress that this isn't a kind of unmet promise of Schengen or a failure of Schengen. This is how it was meant to be. It was always set up as a guarantee of free movement for citizens of European Community and then European Union member states, and meant to exclude non-citizens. So this is how it was designed. It's not a kind of flaw in the system or a recent change. In practice, of course, this has been and remains difficult to police. One of the parts of the treaty making that I quote in the book is a French treaty maker saying, in practice, it's hard to make this distinction because neither European citizens nor non-citizens have their nationality written on their face. So in terms of once controls are removed and there's this allowance of free movement, how do you meaningfully distinguish between citizens and non-citizens? And this of course, remains a challenge. I was very interested to see just in recent days, Merz in Germany, the candidate for chancellor, make this pledge to, completely crack down on irregular migration. It's not clear to me how one would do that without ending Schengen as we know it, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I also think Kiran makes a great point, which is in noting the kind of lack of a protest against the crackdown or as an entity or a police force that would kind of stand up for free movement. And I think, Schengen hasn't had, especially in recent years, passionate advocates. It's been kind of a bête noire for the far right and increasingly under attack by, mainstream and centrist parties. And the job of kind of defending Schengen has fallen to sort of obscure European Parliament reports that try to quantify, the cost of non-Europe and point out that these border closures and controls do have costs when it comes to free trade and commercial growth. But this is hardly a kind of popular appeal to defend the values of free movement. It is a very kind of rationalist, economist enumeration of the economic benefits of free movement, which I think are falling on somewhat deaf ears at the moment.
Can we explore that a little bit further? I mean, you brought up Friedrich Merz, the candidate for the Christian Democrats. You brought up the take on this from some of the more populist movements on the left and the right, and we're certainly seeing that play out in Germany with parties like the Alternative for Germany, but also the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, the alliance around Sarah Wagenknecht, which have been getting support for some of their anti-immigration policies, and obviously there are similar dynamics in places like Italy, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries as well, um, and where we're seeing an influx of refugees and asylum seekers, which is putting pressure on governments to try to respond. And it's, playing directly into what you're talking about when people who are not EU citizens don't have the kind of free movement. So there's a difficult political climate at the moment in many of these countries that doesn't seem to sort of sit well or fit with the ideals of Schengen. And there doesn't seem to be the same kind of economic case that maybe was around when Schengen was founded. I'd be really interested in hearing you both talk a little bit about the political dimension of this.
Maybe just as you said, I think the climate is very different. It's also interesting. We started out this conversation talking about Schengen. Now, this is a small village in Luxembourg that nobody would ever know probably if it weren't for the kind of the whole Schengen story linked to the European Union. Probably from there, we should move for just 1 second up to Dublin, because when it comes to asylum policies, this is not the same story. If you look at just treaties and stipulations and details and so on, because those kind of policies on asylum, when it comes to the EU level, were made kind of in a whole sequence of Dublin agreements. And I think what we see also in the public discourse in Germany and other countries in Europe across the European Union today is that they're all folded together. And there is a xenophobic dimension to all this to say, well, we don't want these people from somewhere else. And what we've also seen, and we shouldn't forget that this is not only something that is happening in the 2020s. For instance, terrorist attacks in 2015 in France, with also terrorists then moving very quickly across the border to Belgium, was also one of the moments when the whole question came up on what this all means for domestic security and sovereignty. What we, of course, also see if we look at these people and these perpetrators is that they are not necessarily undocumented illegal migrants, right? They might be kind of people with passports from member states of the European Union. And also the undocumented kind of migrants that have been harshly critiqued and where there were these terrorist attacks and other kind of forms of violence recently in Germany, for instance. The question still is up whether this has to do with Schengen, whether it's a kind of more domestic problem that has to do with integration of people of different background into a national community and into the European Union, or whether it's a more Dublin related story. And I think it's also one of the populist political strategies to put this all into one box, basically, and come up with these nation-centered policies stressing national sovereignty, which is, of course, also a discourse that we see in many other parts of the world, including the United States. So the whole idea of recreating this notion, I would say to some extent, dream or myth, I would rather say, of national sovereignty is something that is, of course, nothing specific to the member states of the European Union, but is also unfolding here with its specific dynamics and also while glossing over the differences in the legal constructions that inform the various parts of migration policies, of border controls, of asylum policies, also of dealing with people of different backgrounds who might be second, third generation kind of descendants of migrants. And that is part of the problem, I think, in public discourse. And I think this will only get worse in the weeks to come if you talk about the situation in Germany with an upcoming election.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Dublin. And it's important to disaggregate where some of these rules come from, though Dublin draws on Schengen in really important ways. Schengen is one of the first agreements that develops this idea of the rule of first entry, which is what Dublin codifies and is at the root of so much of the asylum crisis and the burden sharing crisis in Europe. Just to spell this out in case people aren't familiar, the rule that stipulates that the country where an asylum seeker first enters is the country responsible for adjudicating that asylum case, which obviously burdens Italy, Greece, the southern countries and Balkan countries vastly more than the northern countries. So Schengen helps develop this principle that is codified and has really become so problematic for Europe. I think that there's this migration and asylum pact, which was negotiated within the EU that was supposed to come into effect, I think, this year, but has been delayed until 2026. And this is cited as an important point in these border closures. So when Germany closed all of its land borders in September of last year, it specifically cited the eventuality of this pact coming into effect and these new rules coming into effect, which will create a different system of burden sharing. So I think there's some anticipation that what if and when some of the asylum chaos is sorted out, it will allow, both on a practical level and also in terms of providing political cover, European governments to sort out their relationship, to Schengen. But I think, just stepping back, the broader story is that it's got, Schengen, as I mentioned, has always been a bête noire for the far right, always, roundly criticized by the far right. And there's this moment in 2014 when a leader of the National Front in France, goes to Schengen and this very theatrical way lays a wreath, as if performing funeral rites for Schengen. And they're always, announcing the death of Schengen. What I think has shifted some, accelerated by the migration crisis in 2015 and the aftershocks of that, accelerated by COVID, accelerating by kind of constant global crisis, whether in the war in Ukraine or the situation with Israel and Gaza, is that it's the criticism of Schengen and the willingness to kind of take it on, and the political liability that emanates from it has become also a centrist concern. So the governments that we've seen crack down and reintroduce controls are, center-right, centrist parties in Germany and in France and in elsewhere. So that's, I think, the political shift. And even more globally, of course, it comes in the context of a backlash against globalization and a backlash against immigration that's unfolding across Western democracies and proving very destabilizing to these democracies. Certainly in the United States, where I'm based, that's the case, and across Europe. So that's, I think, the broader political context.
Maybe just to add one sentence, if I may. I think what we also see that there was a generation of leaders in the 1980s, and like it or not, who just felt that Europe had an added value, full stop, basically, that one needed to further the course of European integration, basically in its own right, right? And Kohl was just one of these protagonists and very powerfully pushed also for Schengen at the time. Now, tell me, who are the political leaders across the European Union today who have any kind of vision? What Europe should be, right? To explain maybe what should be defended, what should be changed in the sense of modified, or what should be added. And I think what we're also witnessing at the moment is a moment where there is no real leadership of sorts when it comes to also discussing and maybe defending to some extent the values of European integration. So again, COVID, I think, was a moment where when it was really put to a real test, and when the crisis was quite big that the whole system of Schengen might collapse, some people then felt, no, we can't really undo this. Let's keep and let's go back to this. But what we've still seen since then, also over the past 2, 3 years, as Isaac rightly said, is an incremental kind of process where through small steps, it's been also jeopardized and kind of demolished to some extent. And the question is, where this will lead us over the next years. I would probably agree with you that the pressure will become even bigger on the system, as again, these concerns have moved from the far right to the political center and also have impacted the political left. So this is the situation where we're in. And the question still is whether there isn't value in the system that people tend to overlook and only will start to regret once borders will fully be reintroduced, as some of us might remember from the 1970s, 80s in Europe, or, if we travel to any other world region where things just are a bit slower because we need to take time to organize visas and cross borders and all these things.
But let me push you both on that a little bit more, because it seems to me as sort of an outside observer that we're on the cusp of something new where the EU is going to try to monitor the flow and movement of people a little bit more closely, and at the same time sort of reinforce its external borders. And of course, I'm talking about this long anticipated entry/exit system for registering non-EU citizens in the Schengen area, as well as sort of an online travel authorization system that's a lot like ESTA in the US. Can you talk a little bit more about what the impact of these mechanisms could be like?
I mean, I think much of this has been tried. It's being enhanced. There are new methods, new efforts, but there have been efforts like this in the past, and it's hard to confront the fundamental problem that there are people in Africa or elsewhere who will die trying to reach Europe, and there's only so much that an entry registry or otherwise can do about that. Short of just the immense kind of barriers and barbed wire fencing and otherwise. So it's difficult to get at the root cause of that, I think. That's the issue. I think a lot may hinge on the effectiveness of this new migration and asylum pact. I'm somewhat skeptical of the notion that new kind of digital means or tracking systems can really do much to return the kind of sense of control that the nation states may desire.
This was already the dream in the 1980s when computers were there already, and where also this really led to a leap kind of in also data creation and data sharing across nation states, basically the whole Schengen system. But I would agree with Isaac, it's going to be very problematic if you want to keep this huge an area open. And if you want to allow people to come for business for all kinds of reasons and leave, to really create a system that works. So besides the systems that we just mentioned, I think something else when it comes to undocumented migrants has become more important. And that is, to use an ugly word, to bribe or to have agreements with neighboring countries in North Africa, in the near Middle East, to basically make sure that they take care of the problems of migration and don't allow people from those countries. From Turkey, this is the infamous 2016, 15-16 deal, to North African countries, then kind of cross the Mediterranean into countries of the European Union. And this is probably more powerful and more important than these other means, the ESTA-like systems that the European Union tries to introduce. So I think when it comes to migration to borders, a lot also is symbolism, right? A lot will be bureaucracy, and probably the means that are more effective when it comes to illegal, undocumented migrants have to do with these more ugly deals, I would say, that again have to do with beefing up, for instance, the police forces in these North African countries under horrible conditions also, where human rights are being violated of these people coming from sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. But again, it is not done in the member states and makes Europeans feel, sleep happier at night. And that is part of the cynicism also of the system. Nothing specific to the European Union, but something that also unfolds and qualifies any talk about human rights and transparency and so on. That is also part of the rhetoric.
In terms of symbolism, do either of you think that there are any other countries that could join Schengen in the near future, or do you think that it's really sort of set where it is right now?
Well, we'll see what happens with Ukraine. I think that it's obviously this barely figures in my book, which doesn't go up to much detail about the war, but thinking about the Maidan Revolution and what that meant in terms of aspirations for entry into the EU and the kind of freedoms that would allow. But if and when that the war is concluded, on what terms and what kind of agreements are made with respect to a pathway to NATO, a pathway into the EU, I think that is something to watch.
Let me add a slightly cynical footnote. Greenland. Greenland is part, if you will, of the European Union. It is part of Denmark, but it is not part of Schengen to this day. And again, depending also what US policies will bring over the next years. And we've seen that already. So it's interesting because Greenland was first part of the European communities proper, and then left and is now only an associated state of the European, or part of the European Union. But what we've seen over the past years that it has moved closer to wanting being part of the European Union proper and moving further away from Denmark. Now, with the new kind of talk from Washington, the whole situation might change, and the whole idea of forging ever closer links to the European Union might become even stronger. We're talking about some 50,000 people here, so it's not a huge country. It's a huge territory, of course.
Right.
So in that sense, I think what we see is a situation where the idea that we had in the 90s and 2000s that this will expand as the European Union does expand, that is probably not what we're discussing anymore, right? So that moment where also the European integration project was kind of imbued with almost a missionary idea that this is a model for Europe, this is a model for the world. I think that moment is basically over. But I would
Mhm.
still expect there changes to come, which do not always and exclusively imply that borders will go up and that the system will be crumbling. There might be other dimensions also, which have to do also again with external pressures. So
Mhm.
Isaac was explaining, kind of referring to Russia basically as an external other. I would not want the Americans, kind of the United States, to become one of the other external pressures that would then lead to further expansion of Schengen. But I fear that this is not completely impossible.
But I think putting it in a broader context, just thinking about geopolitics in general, having a significant impact on Schengen and what happens within Europe in that sense as well. And Russia and the United States are two factors in that, but they're not the only factors as well.
Absolutely.
There are a number of other questions that I had wanted to sort of ask you about, but we're running out of time, and we did not really talk about the impact of Schengen on the labor market. Kiran, you did talk a little bit about your personal experience being able to cross the border. Isaac, you talked about the sort of economics of Schengen or the economic rationale of Schengen, which of course had to do with the free movement of people, i.e., influencing the labor market, but also the free movement of capital and goods. As we sort of wrap up, do either of you have any thoughts on the current sort of barriers to Schengen and how they impact the national labor markets in Europe or even the European labor market writ large? Do you see issues there that are relatively or that are possible to overcome?
Well, I think a lot of this importantly goes back before Schengen and the freedom of workers to move within Europe has been kind of pillar, even before Schengen. There's been, of course, associated controversies, very visibly in the UK, again, not a member state of Schengen, the Polish plumber and so forth in the early 2000s. But to stick with the theme of Germany, the new guest workers and with the population slowdown are absolutely critical to Germany and to Germany's kind of economic future. So figuring out how to pair that with some of the heightened controls and the backlash to immigration, I think is going to be a huge challenge for the next government and for governments to come. I'm forgetting the figures, but I think I saw recently there was some study or announcement about the scale of the challenges and how many new workers were needed to power the economy and that will have to be married with some of this heightened sensitivity around migration and free travel.
Yeah, absolutely. Given the demographic trends that exist here, that's an absolute necessity.
Yeah,
Kiran, the last
because
word goes to you.
it's home to Luxembourg again, because Schengen is a small place in Luxembourg. Again, I think Luxembourg is a small country that people tend to ignore as a member state as it is of the European Union. But if you just look at the number of people who on a daily basis, commute into Luxembourg from the neighboring countries, including Germany and France, that whole system would collapse, right? And you probably wouldn't have a better laboratory to see what it means for a national economy if borders would go up again. So the
Mhm.
whole economic model that has developed in Luxembourg over the past decades is really also hinging on borders being open. And in that sense, it's an extreme case, but also, as Isaac rightly said, also shows what it would mean for other people. Let me just end with one thing. We haven't talked about Isaac's book. I just like to recommend it. I think it's really one of the first studies that really shows how the system came into being. And if there's only one other thing that I want to stress that I like about it is that it doesn't just talk about the politicians and the dealers and shakers who created the system, but also brings in the perspective of people, including these undocumented migrants and what it meant for them. So in that sense, it's not a celebratory triumphalist story, but shows also what it meant for people from different walks of life. And I think that is also important as the discussion moves on and for discussions that will have also what the practical implications will be if the tendency to close borders will continue.
So let me just remind everybody what the title of Isaac's book is. It's Europe Without Borders, and I can also recommend it as well. I think you're absolutely right, Karen. It's an important read to understand, again, the history that we've been talking a little bit about, but also some of the dynamics that are going on the ground today. But I would just like to thank both of you for sharing your thoughts with us, Isaac and Kiran. This has been a great discussion that has really put into context some of the very important trends and challenges that exist in modern Europe, but putting it in that historical context and knowing kind of how we got here. So thank you both very much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.